They had just moved into the neighborhood, a quiet black couple unpacking boxes, laughing softly, trying to make a house a home. But to one neighbor, their presence felt out of place. She called the police, convinced something suspicious was happening. What she didn't know was that the couple she suspected wasn't just new. They were about to become the most respected people on the block. And when the truth came out, it didn't just change her. It changed the entire neighborhood. The moving truck rumbled to a stop, its engine humming low like it too was taking a breath. Danielle Allen leaned against the open car door, one hand shielding her eyes from the early afternoon sun. Marcus stepped out beside her, a wide grin spreading across his face as he took in the pale brick house, the trimmed hedges, the quiet street wrapped in late summer stillness. "This is it," he said, more to himself than to her. Danielle nodded, her voice soft. "Feels good, doesn't it?" It did. It felt like something they had earned. After years of late nights, residency shifts, courthouse hearings, and student loans that once seemed like cliffs, they were finally here. Maple Glen, a neighborhood where the lawns looked rehearsed, where the birds sounded edited, where the welcome mat said hello in 5 languages, but rarely meant it. The back of the car popped open. Marcus reached for a box labeled kitchen, fragile, careful not to jostle it. Danielle laughed, holding up her phone to snap a picture of him, squinting at the handwriting, like it was a court document. Music floated from the speakers. Stevie Wonder, soft and warm, and for a moment it all felt easy. Across the street, behind a drawn curtain, Eleanor Whitmore adjusted her blinds. She squinted, watching the couple with narrowed eyes. 2 unfamiliar faces, a U-Haul truck, boxes. She noted every detail like she was filing a report in her mind. The man carried himself too confidently, the woman too stylish. Something about the way they laughed struck her as bold, like they weren't trying to blend in, like they didn't know this street came with expectations. Marcus carried another box to the porch, setting it down gently. Danielle opened the front door, revealing a bright hallway, and walls still echoing with new paint. "Welcome home," she said, turning back to him. He smiled, walked over, and kissed her forehead. Eleanor watched that too, her lips pressed into a line. She stepped away from the window. Inside their new home, Danielle let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Let's get the heavy stuff in before we lose the light," she said. Marcus nodded, lifting another box with practiced ease, starting with the books. She laughed. "You're the one who packed 6 crates of them." Outside, a breeze stirred the trees. A mailbox creaked shut. A shadow moved behind the window across the street. But inside the Allen house, there was only movement, music, and the kind of hope that wraps itself quietly around new beginnings. Neither of them noticed the curtain shift again, or the phone being picked up, or the quiet voice saying, "Yes, I'd like to report something suspicious." The blinds in Eleanor Whitmore's front room had grooves from years of careful pulling. She never yanked them. She peeled them back, just enough to see without being seen. It was something she'd done for decades, long before the neighborhood changed, before the children grew up, and the new families moved in with different cars, louder music, and shorter greetings. From her window, she had a clear view of 614 Oak Ridge. The house had been empty for months, a lovely 2-story colonial, with a bay window and hydrangeas, that hadn't bloomed right since the Hendersons moved out. Eleanor had always liked that family. Polite, predictable, church every Sunday, wreaths in December, flag on Memorial Day. But today, there was a truck in the driveway, a car with out-of-state plates, boxes stacked on the porch. 2 people she didn't recognize. Eleanor narrowed her eyes. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, strong hands, the kind that could carry a sofa alone. The woman wore a sundress and white sneakers, hair up, laughing, moving with ease, like she belonged. But Eleanor didn't think they did. She told herself it wasn't about them. Not really. She was just being cautious, responsible. There'd been a break-in 2 streets over last month. Teenagers, they said, but she wasn't so sure. People came and went these days. You couldn't be too careful. Eleanor stepped back from the blinds and walked to the kitchen. The house was quiet, except for the ticking clock and the hum of the refrigerator. She poured herself a glass of iced tea, held it to her lips, but didn't drink. Her gaze wandered back toward the window. The couple was unloading again. More boxes, a large framed photo. Laughter. She frowned. It was the laughter that did it. Too carefree, too loud, like they didn't know what kind of neighborhood this was. Or maybe they did, and didn't care. Eleanor set her glass down. She reached for the phone. Not 911. She wasn't ridiculous, but she still had the non-emergency number written in pen near the phone cradle. She dialed with steady fingers. Maple Glen Police. How can I help you? Yes, hi. I'm calling about 614 Oak Ridge. There's a situation, she said carefully. New people. A lot of movement. Unloading things. I don't know if they're supposed to be there. Are they causing a disturbance? Well, no, but it seems suspicious. I think someone should check it out, just to be sure. Thank you, ma'am. We'll send someone to take a look. She hung up, stood still, listened to the quiet of her house like it could validate her choice. Then she returned to the window, lifted the blind, peered through the slats. Outside, the couple smiled at each other as they carried a box inside, still laughing. Inside, Eleanor watched, waiting, reassured by the idea that someone with a badge would sort things out, like always. The phone clicked softly as Eleanor placed it back in the cradle. She stood there for a moment, hands still resting on the receiver, the silence of her house folding back around her like a shawl. Outside, the world kept moving. Boxes shuffled, car doors opened and closed, the gentle thud of feet on front steps. Normal sounds maybe. But something about them didn't sit right with her. She walked back to the window, her iced tea untouched on the table. Through the slats, she saw the woman Danielle, though she didn't yet know her name, balancing a small plant in one hand, a set of books in the other. She moved with comfort, like she owned the place. That confidence, Eleanor thought, didn't match the uncertainty she felt. Possible trespassers, she had said. Her voice had been calm, deliberate. There's just a lot of movement, she'd told the dispatcher. A car full of things. I'm not sure they're supposed to be there. Could someone maybe check it out? Just in case. The dispatcher's voice had been kind but routine. We'll send someone by, ma'am. Thanks for letting us know. And with that, Eleanor had done her part. Civic duty. Neighborhood watch. Unofficial but necessary. It wasn't about color, she told herself. It was about caution. Safety. She'd called once when a group of teenagers loitered on the corner for too long, and again when a man selling solar panels knocked too hard on her door. This wasn't so different. She stepped into her living room, rearranged a stack of magazines on the coffee table, then sat on the edge of her recliner, like she was waiting for a performance to start. Every few seconds, her eyes drifted back to the window. Across the street, Marcus appeared at the top of the porch steps, wiping sweat from his brow. He looked around, took a deep breath, then went back inside. Eleanor watched the door close behind him. She folded her hands in her lap. She felt proud, responsible, like she had caught something before it became a problem, like she was still part of the solution. Her house was still. The same wallpaper she'd chosen in the 80s, the same oak trim her late husband had varnished by hand, everything in its place. But outside, change had arrived, quietly, unannounced, unapologetic, and somewhere, a police cruiser was being dispatched, its wheels already turning, toward a house where no crime had occurred, and a couple whose only offense was moving in. The sound of tires crunching gravel broke the rhythm of the afternoon. Marcus was halfway down the porch steps, a lamp in his hands, when he heard it. 2 patrol cars pulling up to the curb, their engines idling low, doors clicking open in practiced unison. The air shifted. The sun still shone, but the warmth in it suddenly felt staged. Danielle, kneeling beside a stack of kitchen boxes in the garage, glanced up. She saw the flash of red and blue. Her hands stopped moving. Her breath caught. The officers stepped out. 2 men, both white, both wearing dark sunglasses that mirrored the sky, and none of the faces behind it. Their postures were casual, but their hands hovered near their belts. Not drawn, but close enough to remind you they could be. Marcus set the lamp down slowly on the porch, straightened up. "Afternoon," he said, polite but puzzled. His voice was steady, practiced. It had learned long ago how to disarm without pleading. The taller officer nodded, not returning the greeting. "We got a call," he said. "Concern about some suspicious activity." Marcus blinked. Suspicious. The second officer was already scanning the yard, the porch, the garage, the boxes, the car. Danielle stood behind a row of moving bins, her body still, her eyes fixed on Marcus. "Yes, sir," the taller one said. "We just need to confirm you're supposed to be here." Marcus reached into his back pocket, slow and deliberate. "We just moved in. I've got the paperwork inside, or I can give you ID. The officers didn't move, but the tension didn't ease. Danielle stepped forward, her voice quiet, but clear. We can show you the deed. It's in the important documents box, right by the door. The second officer looked at her, but didn't respond. Instead he glanced back at his partner. A silent exchange passed between them. Then a nod. Let's see that ID first, the taller one said. Marcus handed over his license. Danielle disappeared briefly into the house, and returned with a thick envelope, the kind realtors give you when keys change hands. She held it out. The officer barely glanced at it. He was already running Marcus's name through the system. Silence settled on the front lawn. A bird chirped once, then seemed to think better of it. Danielle stood beside Marcus now, their shoulders brushing. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. The message was already loud enough. 2 officers, 2 cars, hands near holsters, suspicion where welcome should have been. The radio in one cruiser crackled. The taller officer handed Marcus back his license. All right, he said. Seems in order. Have a good day. They turned without apology. Marcus and Danielle watched them leave, their presence trailing behind like fog. No tickets, no warnings, just the echo of a call that never should have been made. The taller officer held Marcus's license between 2 fingers, like it might reveal something more if he stared long enough. His partner stood off to the side, glancing between the house, the car, and Danielle, who was now rifling through a box labeled important. Do not lose. She found it near the top, an oversized manila envelope, thick with documents, and embossed with the seal of the real estate company. Her hands didn't shake, but her breath was clipped. She crossed the lawn slowly, holding the packet like evidence, in a trial she didn't volunteer to be part of. This has the deed, she said, her voice calm but pointed, and our closing documents. We signed last Tuesday. The second officer reached out for it, hesitating just long enough to suggest she might be holding something dangerous. He flipped through the pages quickly, his brow furrowing, not at the content, but at the implication that this wasn't going to end the way he expected. Neighbors watched now, through blinds, around corners, from porches they hadn't left in hours, faces peeking out like shadows on curtain edges. Danielle saw them, so did Marcus, but they kept their posture straight, their tone measured, their frustration folded neatly beneath courtesy. The taller officer tapped Marcus's license against his palm. And what's your occupation, sir? Marcus glanced at him. I'm a judge, he said. Flat, honest, no embellishment. The officer's head tilted slightly, like maybe the title hadn't matched the image he'd built in his mind. Danielle added, I'm a doctor, Dean of Medicine at St. John's Set. The silence that followed didn't last long, but it lingered. The kind that makes you wonder if the wind had stopped just to listen. The taller officer looked down. Everything checks out, he muttered. The other handed back the documents. You folks have a good day. Marcus took his license. Danielle took the envelope. Neither said thank you. The officers returned to their cruisers. One of them clicked something into a tablet, mounted near the dashboard. The other kept glancing toward Eleanor's house, though he never said why. The engine started. The cruisers pulled away. No apology, no acknowledgement, just the sound of tires rolling over pavement that had never been theirs to begin with. Danielle exhaled as if she'd been holding her lungs in since the sirens first blared. Marcus placed a hand on her back. We're home, he said softly. Not for reassurance, for truth. Around them, the street returned to its usual stillness. But something had shifted. The couple was real. The paperwork was real. And the call, that had been nothing more than a projection, wrapped in assumption, disguised as concern. Danielle held the deed in one hand, the other resting lightly on her hip. The officers had turned to go, the tension draining from their shoulders, now that their check boxes were ticked. But she wasn't done. Can I ask? She said. Her voice even. Who exactly reported us? The taller officer paused. His back was to them. He didn't turn around. Just a call, he said. Anonymous tip. Danielle stepped forward, just enough to close the space between her voice and his silence. Right. But it came from someone on this street, didn't it? No answer. The second officer, younger and less practiced, shifted his weight. His gaze wandered, casual, but careless, and settled for half a second too long on the house across the street. The one with the pale yellow shutters, and the blinds that always seemed a little too perfectly tilted. Eleanor's house. Danielle didn't need confirmation. Neither did Marcus. She turned to him. Their eyes met. Nothing dramatic passed between them, just understanding. This wasn't new, not to them, not to anyone who had ever lived in a world where your zip code didn't shield you from someone else's discomfort. But something about this time felt different. Maybe because it was their first day. Maybe because they had done everything right, and still had to prove they belonged. Or maybe because they were just tired. The officers offered vague nods and made their way back to the cars. The taller one opened his door, hesitated, then looked over his shoulder. "Sorry for the inconvenience," he said, without looking either of them in the eye. Danielle didn't reply. She just watched them go, lips pressed tight. Marcus stood beside her, quiet. He could feel her pulse in the air, like static before a storm. Across the street the blinds in Eleanor's window moved, barely. A whisper of guilt, or curiosity, or both. Danielle saw it. She didn't flinch. "She watched us the whole time," she said softly. Probably called the second she saw the boxes. Marcus nodded. Probably didn't even wait to hear us speak. They stood on the lawn for a moment longer, the neighborhood still around them. No wind, no birds. Just the quiet hum of something unspoken. Then Danielle turned and headed toward the house. Not defeated, not angry. Resolved. "Let's finish unpacking," she said. Marcus picked up the lamp he had set down earlier. They had moved into a home. But this wasn't just about walls and keys. It was about being seen. And now, about being heard. Because this time they weren't going to let it slide quietly into memory. This time the story wasn't ending with the police pulling away. It was just beginning. The patrol cars eased down the street, sunlight bouncing off their rear windows as they turned the corner and disappeared. Eleanor stood behind the blinds, one hand still clutching the fabric, the other resting on her chest like it might steady the unease that had started to bloom. No arrests, no raised voices, not even a citation, just polite conversation. A few documents exchanged, and a handshake that never came. It didn't sit right with her. Something was missing. Or maybe something was too present. A confidence, a familiarity those two carried that she couldn't quite reconcile with the story she'd told herself. She let the blinds fall and moved to the kitchen. Sat at the table, stirring her tea long after the sugar had dissolved. The street outside returned to stillness, but in her chest, a dull thud echoed. Not panic, not guilt, just a quiet knot of confusion she couldn't quite name. That night, she barely slept. Something about the day kept replaying in her head. The way the man stood so calmly, the woman's eyes steady and unimpressed, the officer's silence before glancing at her house. Eleanor told herself she was doing the right thing, looking out for the neighborhood. It wasn't personal, just precaution. But when the morning came, and the sun poured over the neatly trimmed lawns of Maple Glen, a white envelope sat waiting in her mailbox. She noticed it immediately, unmarked, no postage, delivered by hand, her name written in blue ink, soft and careful. She brought it inside, opened it slowly. Inside was a single sheet of linen paper. "Dear neighbor, we wanted to take a moment to introduce ourselves properly. We're Marcus and Danielle Allen, your new neighbors at 614 Oak Ridge. We moved in yesterday, and are excited to become part of the Maple Glen community. We understand that new faces can sometimes come with questions. So we'd like to extend a warm invitation to a housewarming brunch this Sunday. It'll be simple. Coffee, food, good conversation. We hope you'll join us. Sincerely, Dr. Danielle Allen, Judge Marcus Allen." Eleanor read it once, then again. She sat down. Her eyes lingered on the titles. Dr. Judge. Her hand trembled slightly, not from shock, but from the slow collapse of certainty. The assumptions she'd folded so neatly inside herself no longer fit. She looked toward their house across the street. Sunlight hit their porch. A wreath hung on the door. Two small planters sat on the steps, already watered. She had called the cops on a doctor and a judge, and they'd sent her a brunch invitation. Her tea had gone cold, but her cheeks had never felt so warm. The invitations weren't flashy, just thick ivory paper, folded clean down the middle, with navy ink that looked hand-pressed even though it wasn't. No clip art, no exclamation points, just words chosen carefully, like a welcome mat that didn't scream, "Look at us," but simply said, "We're here. Come if you'd like." Danielle sat at the dining table that Friday afternoon, her handwriting steady as she addressed each envelope by name. Marcus slid the finished ones into a neat pile, double-checking the street numbers. They didn't mention the police stop, or the blinds that fluttered just a little too often, or the whispers that had already begun to snake their way down Oak Ridge. Instead they focused on what mattered more. You're invited to a casual housewarming brunch, hosted by your new neighbors, Dr. Danielle Allen, Dean of Medicine, St. John's Hospital, and Judge Marcus Allen, 12th District Court, Sunday, at 11 a.m. 614 Oak Ridge Lane. Coffee, food and a chance to meet. We'd love to get to know you. Danielle reread the final card before sealing it. "It's honest," she said. "No need to hide who we are." Marcus nodded. "And no need to announce it louder than that." The next morning, they walked door to door, slipping invitations into mailboxes, greeting a few early risers with warm hellos and modest smiles. Some responded kindly. Others watched from porches, hands wrapped around mugs, eyes trailing them without a word. No one mentioned the patrol cars. No one had to. By noon, Eleanor found her own envelope resting inside her box. She'd already read the first letter 3 times, but this one felt heavier somehow. She brought it inside, sat at her kitchen table, and stared at the names at the bottom. Dean of Medicine, 12th District Court. The words curled under her skin like heat. Not just doctor, not just judge, but leadership, prestige. People who had earned the right to walk into any neighborhood, and still got questioned for stepping onto their own porch. Eleanor set the card down gently, her fingers lingering at the edge. The guilt didn't burn, but it pressed, steady, unavoidable. Across the street, 614 Oak Ridge looked no different, the same flowers, the same porch. But now it had a pulse, a presence, and Eleanor couldn't ignore it. She hadn't known who they were, now she did, and she'd just been invited to brunch, by the very people she'd once assumed didn't belong. By Saturday afternoon, the neighborhood chat thread, usually reserved for lost pets and bake sale reminders, had become something else entirely. It started with a photo. A woman 3 houses down from Eleanor snapped a picture of the brunch invitation and posted it with a short caption. "Anyone else get this?" Within minutes, replies rolled in. "Wait, Dean of Medicine? Judge Marcus Allen? The Marcus Allen? I just Googled them. Wow. Why didn't we know who they were before?" Screenshots flew back and forth, LinkedIn profiles, news articles, a YouTube clip of Marcus delivering a keynote on juvenile reform. Someone found an op-ed Danielle had written about healthcare equity. It had over 80,000 shares. The more people looked, the more the pieces didn't align with the assumptions that had hung in the air like dust the day the patrol cars rolled in. Danielle and Marcus weren't just professionals. They were public voices, mentors, leaders. They weren't just new neighbors. They were exactly the kind Maple Glen liked to boast about, when they could claim them. Only now those whispers didn't sound like pride. They sounded like embarrassment wrapped in curiosity. Eleanor read the messages from her tablet, heart tightening with every new ping. She hadn't joined the thread, just watched from behind her screen, as her neighbors pieced together the truth she hadn't even bothered to ask about. People were stunned. The couple she had called the police on, because they didn't look right, because they were too confident unpacking their own belongings, were both more accomplished, more grounded, and more gracious than she'd ever imagined. And they were throwing brunch. No resentment, no public call-out, just an open invitation to break bread. Somewhere on the block, a child asked their parents what a judge actually does. A few doors down, a woman stood at her sink wondering how Danielle found time to be a doctor and a dean. And in houses all along Oak Ridge, quiet reflection set in. Because it wasn't just about being wrong, it was about never bothering to be curious before being cautious. Never asking who someone is before deciding what they might be. Eleanor closed the chat thread. Her face is warm. Her chest is heavy. Across the street, the house she had once watched through blinds, now looked different. Not because anything had changed, but because she had. The smell of fresh coffee and warm cinnamon rolls drifted down Oak Ridge Lane, carried by the soft Sunday breeze. At 11 a.m., sharp, the doors of 614 opened. And for the first time since the moving truck had pulled away, the street walked toward the house instead of just watching it. Neighbors came in slow trickles at first, Couples holding hands, toddlers in tow, retirees gripping mason jars of homemade jam. The conversations were cautious, polite. Too many compliments on the hydrangeas, too many such a lovely home remarks. The smiles were wide, but they didn't reach far. Danielle met each guest at the door, her posture effortless, her voice warm. "We're so happy you came," she said again and again, and every time it sounded like she meant it. Marcus floated between conversations like a practiced host, firm handshake, light humor, the kind of ease that didn't demand attention, but drew it all the same. He handed out plates, refilled orange juice, knelt to greet a shy child, peeking from behind her mother's legs. The brunch buffet stretched across a long white table, croissants, frittatas, berry salads in glass bowls. Nothing extravagant, but everything intentional. And then about 20 minutes in, Eleanor appeared. She wore her church shoes, and a cardigan that trembled slightly in the breeze. Her lipstick was the wrong shade for morning, and she knew it. She hovered at the edge of the driveway, unsure if she had the right to walk any further. Danielle spotted her first. She excused herself from a conversation, walked to Eleanor with a glass of mimosa in hand, and offered it without ceremony. "We're glad you came," she said softly. Eleanor's fingers trembled slightly as she accepted the glass. Her eyes searched Danielle's face for judgment, for anger, but she found neither, just kindness. And that, somehow, felt heavier. Inside, Eleanor moved with careful steps. She murmured quiet hellos, took a bite of fruit she didn't taste. Every room buzzed with laughter and cautious admiration. Someone told Marcus they'd seen his courtroom speech on YouTube. Another asked Danielle how she managed hospital life and a move. The questions came slowly, but they came. By noon, the stiffness began to melt. Children ran through the grass. Someone offered to help with dishes. Neighbors started lingering longer between sips, and somewhere between the second round of coffee and the final "thank you for having us," something shifted. Not everything, not overnight, but enough to begin. As guests trickled out, Danielle and Marcus stood on the porch, thanking each one like they hadn't seen the blinds twitch or felt the weight of suspicion days earlier. Because this wasn't about proving they belonged. It was about showing what happens when you open your door anyway. The guests were starting to leave, voices trailing into the afternoon sun, chairs being folded, napkins gathered into soft stacks. The hum of conversation faded into the quiet rustle of breeze through leaves. And for a moment, the yard exhaled. Danielle stood near the back porch, sipping the last of her mimosa, watching Marcus talk with a group of neighbors. His laugh rose above the hush, a sound that didn't beg for attention, but held it anyway. Eleanor waited until most people had gone. She walked with purpose, but her steps slowed the closer she got, like her feet weren't quite ready for what her heart had decided. "Dr. Allen?" she said gently. Danielle turned. Eleanor's hands fidgeted with a napkin she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her voice came quieter than she expected. "I owe you an apology." Danielle didn't move, didn't blink, just gave her the space to say what needed saying. "I made the call," Eleanor said. "That day you moved in. I thought," her words caught. "I assumed." There it was. Not just guilt, but ownership. Danielle lowered her glass. Her face didn't harden. It didn't soften either. It just listened. Eleanor looked down. "I've lived here 32 years. I thought I was someone who wouldn't." Her breath hitched. "But I did." Danielle's eyes didn't waver. "It happens more than you know." The words were steady, not forgiving, not accusing, just true. Weighted not with anger, but something heavier. History, repetition, the exhaustion of being gracious when you shouldn't have to be. Eleanor looked up, bracing for rejection, but Danielle stepped closer, instead. "What you choose next," she said. "That's what matters." Eleanor's eyes filled, but she blinked them clear. "I'd like to learn, not just say sorry. Really learn." Danielle nodded slowly. "Then you're already choosing better than most." There was no dramatic embrace, no swelling music, just two women standing beneath the weight of what had been, and what could be, one owning her mistake, the other choosing not to carry it for her. Eleanor exhaled. "If you ever need help around the garden," she said, almost sheepishly, "I have a very stubborn rose bush that thinks it knows everything." Danielle cracked the faintest smile. "I'd like that." They stood in the sun for another moment, the silence between them no longer strained, just open. When Eleanor walked back across the street, she didn't look over her shoulder. She didn't have to. For the first time since they moved in, Danielle watched her go, without wondering who might be watching her. The weeks rolled on in Maple Glen, quiet as ever, but something in the rhythm had shifted. It started with the small things, waves from porches that lingered a second longer, conversations that stretched beyond weather and trash day, questions asked with genuine curiosity, not masked scrutiny, the kind that said I want to know you, not I want to place you. Danielle began hosting monthly meetups in her backyard, simple gatherings, open to all, no agenda, just space. Space to talk, to listen, to be, and people came. They brought casseroles and folding chairs, old stories and new questions. Children played in the grass while their parents stood in circles that hadn't existed a month before. Marcus helped organize a legal literacy workshop at the local library, and when he spoke about justice and reform, the room was full, not just with people, but with attention. Eleanor came to every gathering. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, her voice carried a humility that hadn't been there before. She joined a community initiative Danielle started, one focused on equity and neighborhood services, on ensuring no family felt unseen or unheard. She didn't just sign her name, she showed up, week after week, and Danielle noticed. So did Marcus, so did everyone else. The street began to bloom, not with flowers or flags, but with something deeper: trust, connection, change. Not everyone changed. Some kept their distance, some still held their silence close, like armor they weren't ready to set down. But even that silence felt less certain now, as if the neighborhood itself had begun asking questions it never used to. At 614 Oak Ridge, life moved forward, curtains opened wider, laughter drifted from open windows. And sometimes in the evening, when the sky melted into soft streaks of gold, you could see Danielle and Marcus on the porch, hands intertwined, heads leaned close, watching the street they'd helped reshape. They hadn't meant to become anything more than neighbors. They had just wanted to come home. But in doing so, with grace instead of bitterness, strength instead of spectacle, they planted something lasting, not a perfect harmony, but a deeper kind of awareness, the kind that turns a street into a community. And one day, as fall settled in, and the trees traded green for amber, Eleanor walked her stubborn rose bush across the street in a pot, handing it to Danielle with a crooked smile. "It's ready for new soil," she said. Danielle took it, her eyes soft. "So are we." And just like that, what started as a misunderstanding became a beginning. If this story moved you, don't just scroll, share it. Because change doesn't always start in courtrooms or city halls. Sometimes, it starts on a quiet street, with an open door, a steady voice, and the courage to listen. Like the video. Subscribe for more true stories of justice, grace and awakening, and comment below. Have you ever seen a neighborhood transform?